Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the Apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the Apocalypse engine. I'm your MC, Rich.
And I'm your co-MC, Rach.
And we have brought on a special guest, a return aficionado of role-playing games, Paul Beakley of Indie Game Reading Club. How you doing, Paul?
I'm great,
Hey.
Rich. How are you? Hi, Rach.
We brought Paul on because he's run a few PbtA games. He's a multi-gamer. You know, indie games, not just PbtA, but he's run a fair number of them. And we wanted to have him on so we could talk a little bit about how would you start a new Apocalypse Engine game. So we're trying not to be game specific, but technique specific. And we're going to talk about how, as an MC, you can do it. We'll also talk a little bit about if you're a player in a brand new PbtA game. So hopefully you'll garner some tips and tricks here. And if you have thoughts to share with us, of course, you're always welcome to give us feedback over Twitter or on the Gauntlet RPG website. So that's our beginning spiel. Starting a new PbtA game. Paul, you're the expert. What are the kind of things that you need to know when you're stepping up to a table to run a PbtA game for a group?
Obviously, context. If it's a convention, it's probably going to be a one-shot.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly a long con, might be a two-shot. I've run up to a three-shot, and that worked okay. But if I'm playing at home, I really kind of want to know from my players if they just want to experiment with it, just try it one time. We've done that a few times. Or do they want to do like a limited run, like a three-shot, which is more or less a nice, if we screw up the first one, no harm, no foul. We'll roll into the second one. We'll commit to a third one. We'll just be done at that, right? Or is it going to be like kind of a standard? I'm putting air quotes in the air on the screen. You can't hear this, obviously. But like for me, like a standard PbtA run, which is like 6-ish sessions. And I don't know why it is, but almost all the PbTAs I run feel like they are pretty played out around 6. Or we want to go for a long run, which is like 10-ish. And I've only done that once to my memory.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to cover a lot of material because of the blog and
Right.
So
No,
I
you've got
tend
to
to run
mix it
things
up.
a little bit faster. Yeah.
Makes sense.
We decide how long it's going to be. Make that an intentional decision.
Mm-hmm.
By everybody. Everybody has to kind of buy in. Like, okay, I'm in for 3. I'm in for 6. I'm in for 10. I'm in for 1. Whatever. I don't know that you can really force that on people, although I suppose you could, as a kind of a strong arm MC, just say, look, I'm going to run this thing for 3. You can eat at my table, but you're going to have to eat what I make. And this is what I'm making as a 3-shot.
Mm-hmm.
But another topic that once we kind of figure out the length is figuring out if we're going to figure out the setting or if we're going to figure out the playbooks. And boy, you can kind of go either way with that, right? Like, what are the playbooks that look kind of hot to play? Or are we going to do that, world building is part of play element first, and then figure out playbooks that sound kind of fun to plug into that situation you've just invented?
What's your preferred way of guiding the creation?
Playbooks. Playbooks all day and night. Yeah, playbooks are the way to go. I haven't always done that. In some cases, we have started with a strong setting or situation, almost like in Masks. You've got the supplement that has like the school setting, and then remember, there's like several kind of you can kind of plug into a rough sketch of the setting, figure out, well, these would be kind of cool playbooks to play at the School for Villains or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think I've done that like once, and I think it was Masks. But otherwise, yeah, we just go with playbooks. Just like what would be fun to play, and then start looking for all the interesting friction points between the playbooks, and of course answer the questions that come in the playbooks, as they will usually kind of build out the setting.
Playbooks first is probably my preferred as well. Build the setting around the playbooks, and what kind of setting do they need? What about you, Rach?
When starting as an MC, I actually prefer to start with just like the barest concept of a setting, because that's the part that excites me and gets me that MC momentum to go through a session 0. And I'll present that as an open door for conversation to say, I'm really excited about this type of location. Like, I had an idea, it never played out, that I want to set an Apocalypse World game on the Florida Keys.
Yeah.
And the idea of having like these small little hard holds scattered throughout the keys. And I'd say, this is my vision for the toys I want to play with. Obviously, I want to know what excites you players in terms of playbooks and characters, and then we'll mesh them together in a way that makes sense. So I'm excited about the setting, and I have a little bit of the setting because I do enjoy Googling and researching things on the internet as an MC, but also not 100% married to every single fine detail that I end up researching. Flexibility.
Now, one question I have about Playbooks first, Paul, and this is a little bit of my hobby horse. Do you just show up with all the playbooks you have for that game? Or if based on 1, 3, 6, do you change those options that are offered to the players?
I really do like to curate the selection, and it's almost always based on how long it's going to be.
Hmm.
And it depends on my own mastery of the game. Like, I'm not awesome at all the games all the time. I can only keep 7 or 8 games in my head at once, and I've got dozens to play through every year. But assuming I know what I'm doing, and assuming we know how long it's going to go, I think there are definitely playbooks that lend themselves to hotter, earlier action. And then there are playbooks that lend themselves to longer, slower burns. And again, it kind of depends on the game and the premise. Also, like the social structure of the game. Is it a party game? Is it a community game? Things like that, which also kind of imply the burn rate, how fast the characters will advance. Like in a Dungeon World game, there's a little inter-party kind of, friction, but that's not really what it's about. It's really kind of more externally directed. We're all facing the world together. And so, like, in that case, I would like to see playbooks that run hotter earlier, and I would probably leave out things like the Druid, which if I recall correctly doesn't really work great until it's had a couple of advances. Okay, so in Cartel, the Narco, which is the mob boss, right? And I've played him, but I'm pretty good at creating my own problems and getting into trouble and not avoiding conflict. You have to be very bullheaded about playing it. But if that playbook ends up in the wrong player's hand, it's no good in one session, but it might be great in the same player's hands 5 sessions later after things have built up over a very long period of time. So again, it's the intersection of the player, the playbook, and how much time you're looking at.
Yeah, there are a couple of playbooks for 2 different games that I often will pull if I know if I'm going to a con for a one shot and it's masks. I usually pull the Doomed. I feel that the Doomed and the Doom track needs some space to breathe. So that's one thing that I'll do. Another thing that I'll do in Apocalypse World is pull the Savvy Head. It's just ends up being a really lonely playbook. The right player, that's not true, but as a default assumption, I'm not bringing a Savvy Head to a con game just because then we're going to have pockets of play where, these 2 folks are out right into the range and they're doing some crazy thing with these cannibal clowns, but Savvy Head's working on a thing in their workshop.
Right.
And
which is the problem with the Alchemist, it's the problem with the Netrunner. Every game there is, right? There's some kind of lonely fun little pocket realm that some players are going to be really happy in, but you can't have that at a con table.
Yeah, it sucks too much time away from the group and gelling and hitting a lot of different aspects and having folks talk across the table at each other. That socialization is important to me in a con game, and so I do my very level best to try to avoid that happening because I offered up a playbook that encourages that lonely fun.
Right. Hey, Rach, do you have any memories of a single most kinetic playbook you've ever put your hands on in one session? It just moved the furthest, the fastest?
I've seen the Wolf in Urban Shadows be particularly kinetic and end up drawing people really together if the player is focused on their neighborhood and the relationship between their neighborhood or their territory and how the PCs fit in there, which is great if you want to drag everyone together and you have someone very focused on supporting the table. Can also go bad really easily, but in the right hands can drive things along really aggressively in interesting ways. I ran a con game in Buffalo at Queen City Conquest a couple of years ago where that's exactly what happened, where the player was like, all right, here's my territory. Where do you all live in it?
That's great.
Nice.
So I guess it's a matter of taste too, right? My home group, I think, would be very happy to play explosions, ever-escalating chaos every session and just sit down and just have it just be a romp for 6 sessions in a row. There's no real meaningful through arc to it. There's no intentionality to it. And so they might all go for really hot playbooks in a 6-session format that doesn't really allow for any breathing because no one wants to take a breath. They just all want to go as fast and as hard as they can. Versus like everybody takes a real chill, a bit passive, kind of an emo playbook. We ran the Veil for a bit, and the 3 players took like the 3 slowest burn playbooks. And it took many sessions to kind of find our feet, and by then we're almost unsold on playing the game because why aren't things exploding all around us?
This brings up an excellent point of polling your table and asking, what do you want to get out of this game? And then have that be part of the conversation in terms of building characters. When I used to run Monster Hearts a lot more frequently, I would ask my groups during the start of character generation, what does young adult urban fantasy mean to you? What are your touchstones? What are your expectations? Because I think everyone's expectations, particularly with paranormal romance, is very different. There are some people who just want to exist in those emotions and take a lot of joy out of reliving your teenage depression and angst. And then there's people who want to bring in the SWAT team. Do either of you end up asking your players at the start, like, what are you looking to get out of this game, and use that to curate what happens after?
I think it's a great thing to do at a con, especially when I don't know the folks that come to sit at the table. Hey, so why are you interested in playing Masks today? Or what brought you to the table to try out Hut Cartel? Or why are you here for Apocalypse World? And curate based on that, or make a lot of decisions to try to hit those I want to learn the game. Okay, I want to display as many basic moves as I can, even if I have to nudge people towards making moves when they aren't necessarily inclined. I wanted to see this playbook and play. Okay, well then let's let you drive because you know what the playbook moves are. You've got them right in front of you. You tell me how you're triggering them, that kind of thing. Is that a question you ask at cons when you're running your sagas?
No. Okay, so I show up at events where people tend to know either me or the community or the blog, and there's more of a celebrity drop, micro, femto, nano celebrity, tiny little celebrity con space, right? And so people kind of don't care. They just know that I run a really good game of whatever I'm offering. And I will almost never ask because part of the theatrics of them sitting at my table is they're there to play my game, which is something I will never pull with like friends or people who actually know me because it's nonsense, right? But it's part of the fun of signing up for one of my tables is say, let's see how Paul runs this. And I will sometimes fold in kind of a workshop component if people want to see my relationship map technique. I'll be talking through that and how I do that. Or they want to see or hear more about some particular kind of a GMing or MCing thing that I've talked about on the blog. It comes up kind of a lot. So I actually don't, and I should, and I kind of wish that I could, but it's not the show that I'm putting on.
With Sagas of the Icelanders, that's really a game that's not about an adventuring party per se, right? It's about this community the characters are taking part in and the various rules and expectations of that society. How do you deal with players who go in expecting, we're going to be an adventuring party and this is going to be like D&D and it's going to be like all the actual play podcasts I ever listened to, versus I want to tell a story in this one shot about a place and the different people in the place and the things that happen in there. More, again, about a community.
Honestly, if they don't know what they're getting into, if this is like their first PbtA, and it's not just sagas, it's anything. I mean, I've run into the same thing where you get kind of a D&D mindset player sitting down at a Night Witch's table or whatever.
Oh my.
The best I've been able to do is keep it in the back of my head that they're coming at this thing from a party mindset, and then accommodate my explanation of what's going on in terms of contrast. Whereas normally you might consider all of your pilots in Night Witches to be in the same party off killing fascists. That's not kind of what's happening in this part of the game. Right now you got to deal with misogyny and broken airplane parts and starvation and stress and blah, blah, blah. But it really comes down to, especially in these PbtA games, in terms of explaining the contrast kind of preemptively. And if they continue to really hold on tight to that, I can't do much about that. They just end up kind of having a bad time, and it happens sometimes. But almost never does anymore. It was a problem more years ago when PbtA was less well known as a format and I was less good at it. But these days, if I know they're party oriented, I can figure out why they're party oriented and reroute around that.
Okay, playbooks have been chosen. We're in the first session. Paul, what are the things that you do when you first launch into the game to try to get things going?
Okay, so the walk around in the people's lives thing is solid. Totally solid. It's made sense from the first game forward. It's easy, right? It's pretty easy. I like to frame a little harder than my players are comfortable with as they start doing their walk around their lives part. So I've got this whole concept that I always have in my head that I call the J.J. Abrams School of Game Direction, which is to generate way more provocative hooks than you can ever possibly use and just kind of see how they filter out, how the players choose to engage with them or not, and then rely on everyone's poor memory to just let shit slide. By the second or third session, everyone will have forgotten 2/3 of the interesting hooks I kind of threw out there, and the last third they'll be totally in on. And we'll either be in on them like, oh, what's the conspiracy connecting X, Y, and Z things that Paul mentioned? Or they'll be, oh, we got to go defeat this so-and-so thing. It'll kind of give them goals. And that's all very vague, but the broad idea is every single time someone says, well, okay, so where do you go in your hard hold? Well, I'm going to the bar. Oh, well, why does that bartender keep a head in a box behind the bar? You know, just like just jump ahead. Just go from 0 to 60 like right away. Not just like, what's your favorite drink or shit like that. It's boring. I don't care about your favorite drink is. I want to know why you keep going here even though you know the bartender has a head in a box behind the bar. Or in Urban Shadows. So what does the wizard spend their day doing? Well, I go to my library. I'm like, wow, so why is it your entire library went up in flames last night? Just take it, just run as fast as I can, as quickly as I can.
That's great.
But the library, so cruel.
But the library, no.
Do you have a back pocket A plot in case things don't gel?
Never, ever, 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 ever. No, I just don't.
Brave.
Yeah, it is. I kind of like the thrill of it. I kind of like the, can I pull it off one more time? And it always works out. You know, sometimes it stalls out a little bit. And I think A plots are like backup plans are almost always baked into playbook sets. If we're playing Dungeon World, we got a bunch of hitter types, well, then they probably want to go hit something. You know, that's not a bad thing. If I attempt the J.J. Abrams thing and just nobody grabs on anything, I'm like, fine, let's go kill a chimera or whatever, you know.
Rich, it sounds like you always have a secret plan B in your back pocket.
I like having a backup plan in case folks are boring.
Fair.
Paul, your backup plan is the front forward plan of making their lives not boring. I just will have a few pictures or I'll have something about the setting that interests me that we maybe threw out at the beginning, or a module that I recently read that has a couple of kickers that I'll just throw at folks as my backup plan. It's not a fully formed like entire thing as much as just, if I can't think of anything and we've been boring for more than 5 minutes, I'm going to throw this thing at the group.
How about you, Rach? Do you come to the table with something in your back pocket?
My back pocket tends to be NPC motivations. If the PCs can't find their own plot, I have NPCs with several motivations that will require PCs to get involved. So I will drag the PCs along. And eventually what happens is the PCs realize, not that they're being railroaded, but they're being manipulated by an NPC, and they'll start trying to manipulate the situation to their own interests, and that generates enough of a snowball to keep going till the end of the session.
That's pretty good. Where did the NPCs come from? Did you come up with them before you came to the table?
Usually if I'm doing a convention one-shot, I have like 4 sketched out ideas of people who could exist in a world, because again, I like having a loose setting So I've run games where the setting is Niagara Falls, New York and Canada, both sides of the border. It has a very heavy tourist industry. So I thought of what are 4 NPCs who could be involved in this situation, who have their own problems and cannot solve those problems on their own.
Nice.
I may swap out a name or two in case a name is a little bit too close to a PC name.
Right.
Makes sense.
So something I work hard to achieve, especially early in a Powered by the Apocalypse game, is to build consensus about what the game is and what the world is like. So we're all working on the same playing field.
Mm-hmm.
So we all know roughly what we want to put in and what we want to get out of the game. And I talked about that earlier in the episode with bringing up people's cultural and media touchstones for a specific genre, because that gives me an idea of what the expectations are and where I should be aiming the game.
Yeah.
But you don't want someone to have the idea that we're playing this Monster Hearts game and, the player to my right really wants this soulful, emotional, searching game where we're dealing with all our teenage feelings, and then player to the left being like, it's going to be all violence all the time, and I'm going to live out my teenage power fantasies I couldn't actually live out when I was a teen because I was too cowardly to do it.
So what about building consensus in a way that everyone gets their say, but you aren't watering down the strong ideas by meeting everybody in the middle all the time?
Mm-hmm.
Consensus isn't always good. Sometimes consensus is a little weak because everyone's like meeting everybody else halfway all the time, and none of the strong ideas remain strong. They all remain just sort of safe.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the places where Powered by the Apocalypse actually shines, because you're not too concerned always about being an adventuring party that's doing the same thing at the same time. You can break off your player characters and have them go explore various ideas through the lens of their character, and they do get to spotlight on, I want to have this emotional scene or I want to have this action scene. But it's about balancing the whole table and that kind of vibing together. Like, you don't want the game to drift off too much in one extreme or the other. And there needs to be an eye for reincorporating and weaving the storylines and the characters back together. But you do have that space to go and have a sidebar, as it were.
Sounds a little bit like there are some topics that it's good to have consensus on, and others where you don't need to and probably shouldn't seek it out. Like a common understanding of the setting, that's a good thing to have consensus on. But like each of our arcs, we don't need to all agree on each other's arcs. We can kind of pursue our own arcs and our own interests within the shared understanding of the setting and the overall like rating of the sex and violence and language and everything else.
I think this goes back to the myth of balancing the party and being too concerned about the party as like the central group in which this whole game rotates around, rather than the community and the space and the story.
So let's say that this is a game that isn't just at a con, that there are things that we're doing in session 1 as the MC, assuming we're the MC, that we want to think about for the future, right? So we build those fronts and clocks, because I know, Paul, you've told us all how much they mean.
Yes.
This referring to a previous episode, friends. What are the things that impact your long-term thinking in that early on first session stuff?
There's a fact of how most PbtA games play out, which is that because moves snowball and because of our natural inclination for snowballs to escalate and for the action to escalate, it gets really hard for the players to make plans, which is mixed, right? Like, my first time I ran Urban Shadows and didn't understand I wasn't supposed to make the sort of session move every session.
Oh, no!
And we kept adding new material to the situation, right? And by the third or fourth session, no one could remember what was on the playbook, which is kind of, what are you doing in the city? What do you care about right now? What's your current plan? It was worded differently in every playbook, but everybody had kind of a, what do you care about right now kind of question. Nobody had any idea what those were a few sessions in. So as a just fact of the game, I try to remember that it's real easy to lose track of the players' desires and plans and foci when they start the whole thing out.
Mm-hmm.
Which is more like a warning to myself, to not escalate things so crazy, or to use some of the pot stirring moves in a lot of these games in a more measured way. Like, don't just keep stirring the pot because you have the stick in your hand. You don't have to stir the pot every time. That isn't a planning thing. That's more of a kind of a warning to myself thing. Other long-term thinking specific to PbtA, some playbooks moves are bigger than others. They just are. Not every playbook's fictional outcome is the same kind of container size, right? Sometimes it's a small little blow-by-blow thing that kind of plays out. You win, you lose, you lost something, you got separated, whatever. But sometimes they're much bigger. Sometimes a whole new facet gets introduced. And so I like to be aware of the more consequential moves of the playbooks that got chosen. So I'd always have that little, let's take a 5-minute pee break, and they all kind of wander off. I'll go out, grab all the playbooks, and just look again. Okay. Wait, this one, oh God, there's the vampire's web. Oh Jesus, okay, I gotta think about the vampire's web. And oh right, there's this thing over here, and oh there's the veterans' hideout, and that's going to be an important thing because there's a whole lot of social stuff attached to that. And so my planning tends to want to leave the holes big enough so that they can be filled when those big consequential moves get made. And sometimes big advances, right? Like there's the beginning advances, and frequently there's a later advances kind of set up in these PbtAs.
Mm-hmm,
So your first 4 or 5, improve your stats a couple times, and maybe pick up a basic move or improve one of your basic moves to get the 12 and up benefits. But then there's the second half, the back half advances, and they're much bigger. Things like start a new community, or a lot of these playbooks would have a big, you don't just have a gang, have a nation at your beck and call, or whatever. We did talk about clocks. We did talk about prep in a previous episode. Fronts I kind of like, but I don't really bother trying to fill in all the steps. All I really think about is like the end cap, right? The end goal thing. So this front in Impulse Drive is the rogue AI is going to try to shut down all of the stargates throughout space for whatever nefarious reason. And I just can't make myself fill in all those steps leading up to the AI doing that. It's there. I'm thinking about it, but I'm not ever trying to execute 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, all those little mini steps along the way. In Apocalypse World 2, I can't really make those work for me very well. But I do like having the end cap things to aim towards.
Quick little sidebar, you mentioned grabbing all the playbooks. That is something I'm really, really going to miss once we go back to face cons and playing at houses, is the character keepers, man.
Yes.
Because the way that I design my character keepers, I see everybody's moves all on one part of the sheet, one tab, and I can just look and go, oh man, I see this conversation. I can point this towards that person's move that they haven't triggered in a while. Oh yeah, it seems like they're leaning. They want to do this thing over here. Man, that is some tech that I'm going to miss at a physical table big time. It has really helped me step up my game to make sure that I'm not just angling towards basic moves, but looking at what playbooks are driven to do.
That has been a huge consequence this year, character keepers, and designing them. And all the information design involved with getting it all on one page, and what's important and what's unimportant. And
You can always take the lazy way around it, which I strongly recommend, which is players come back from the break and use the MC, look at them and say, so what moves on your playbook haven't you used that you really want to try out?
That's a good.
That is good. I like that.
I think we've given our listeners a lot of tools for starting a new PbtA game, and I'm really excited to hear what games they launch based off this episode.
Yeah, and if we've missed something, if there's a trick that you have, let us know. Give us some feedback. You can hop on the Gauntlet RPG website, leave us a comment. We'll be posting this out from the +1 Forward Twitter account. Any of those avenues, we are always happy to hear from folks because you may be making my game better, and I'm all about that. Paul, thank you so much for coming on to chat with us and share your knowledge, your deep celebrity knowledge of
Celebrity MC.
Celebrity MC. And don't forget to visit indiegamereadingclub.com, my blog.
That's right. We'll have a link in the show notes. Thanks again, Rach. It's always fun to chat with you.
Yeah, and it's always a great time chatting with you too, Rich.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at @+1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Hammer of Bill. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.
Hi listeners, I want to let you know about Codex Starlight 2, the newest issue of our indie role-playing game magazine, coming to the Gauntlet Patreon feed in early March. Codex Starlight 2 is one of the biggest and best issues yet, and it features Snipe Hunt, an original game inspired by movies like Red Dawn and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which a teenager takes a group of kids out into the woods for a snipe hunt in order to protect them from a calamity taking place in the town they live in. Bed, Breakfast, and Beyond, a one-shot hack of Brindlewood Bay about an elderly gay couple who run a bed and breakfast trying to figure out why guests keep disappearing from room 3. The Temple of the Peerless Star, a trophy gold incursion inspired by the dungeon made famous in the Discern Realities podcast and later published for Dungeon World in the original Codex Starlight. We've taken the core of that dungeon and expanded it for trophy gold, and it's great. 3 dozen more signs the stars are right, a miscellaneous sequel, 7 original illustrations, and a custom layout. You can get Codex Starlight 2 in the Gauntlet Patreon feed in March by making a $6 pledge. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. Thanks.